Okay. Hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm sorry we got started just a few minutes late. We were having some slight technical difficulties. That's just how it goes with, I think, pretty much every Zoom event there is. So thank you for waiting for us and bearing with us. We're very excited for this evening's event. My name is Diane Gettle, and I'm the executive editor here at Black Lawrence Press. And again, I'm just so delighted that you've joined us this evening for a discussion on the craft of poetry. And we'll be speaking with four, we hope, we have three, we'll see about the fourth may be able to join us, four contributors from Far Villages, Welcome Essays for New and Beginner Poets. And I'll begin tonight by introducing our poet essayists who will discuss their contributions to the anthology. And as the panelists are speaking, I really encourage you to drop questions or comments in the chat box because once they have given, their presentations of about 10 minutes each, then we'll just have an open conversation about what they discussed and just continue the discussion of the essentials of poetry and a little bit about craft. And okay, so I'm gonna jump right in and whoops, okay. And let's see, so first up tonight, we are going to have Jason McCall. Hope that's okay with you, Jason, to go first.
That's perfect.
Jason is an Alabama native, and he currently teaches at the University of North Alabama. He holds an MFA from the University of Miami. His collections include Two-Faced God, Dear Hero, winner of the 2012 Marsh Hawk Press Poetry Prize, Silver, I Can Explain, and Mother Less Child, co-winner of the 2013 Paper Nautilus Vella Chapbook Prize. He and PJ Williams are the editors of It Was Written, Poetry Inspired by Hip Hop. So Jason, take it away.
Thank you. And again, thank you to Black Lawrence Press for putting this together, this anthology and this event. Thank you for everybody hanging out with us on Zoom. For me, when I saw this call for submissions, just looking at ideas for beginning poets, beginning writers, I thought a lot about myself when I was a beginning writer. And depending on the day, I always feel like I'm a beginning writer. But I really wanted to think about one of my first, maybe kind of what I thought of as, for lack of a better term, kind of accomplishments as a writer, and how I really looked at that first big checkpoint. So that's where this essay came from. The title is Finding Comfort and Finding Your Comfort Zone. In grad school, I wrote the same poem for 2 years, and I'm a better poet because of it. No, I didn't rewrite every word over and over again like Bart at the beginning of The Simpsons. The titles of the poem changed, the words changed, the subject matter changed. The acceptance rates increased slightly. Sometimes the poem was celebrated in workshop classes. Sometimes it was derided in workshop, but it was always the same poem. Of course, I did not realize I was writing the same poem. I did not see it until one of my advisors made me print out the first draft of my graduate thesis and look at how one poem followed the next poem in the draft. 2 10-line stanzas. The first stanza was an observation or visual description. The second stanza transitioned into a revelation or personal epiphany. There was a reference to a biblical or mythological character. There was a strong enjambment to move the reader from the penultimate line to the finishing line of the poem. My thesis was 60 poems long, and this poem made up over half the poems in the first draft. My advisor told me my manuscript moved in circles. She said my manuscript kept coming back to the same spot, the same poem. She told me that I had mastered that poem. She told me to look for ways to move on from that poem. At first, I was surprised and ashamed. I couldn't help but think of myself as a villain from the Scooby-Doo show who had been unmasked to reveal the fraud, the trickster underneath my poetic facade. However, the more I revised my manuscript and returned to the conversation I had with my advisor, the more my emotions changed. My advisor told me to grow, evolve, and move beyond the poem I had become so comfortable with. However, she told me to move beyond the poem because I had mastered the poem. I never imagined anyone would call me a master of any element of poetry when I started writing in the 9th grade. The closest I had ever come to feeling like a master in anything was winning my 3rd grade spelling bee. I love poetry partially because I've always seen poetry as an act of failure. Poetry, to me, is always an act of trying to hold the sun in place, trying to make an echo last a second longer. All poets are Pandora. All poets are Orpheus and Hades, trying to peek into the forbidden, even though we've been warned by the gods. See, the mythological references will not stay away. When my advisor told me to move on, it was both a stern critique and a genuine compliment. Along with the constant challenge and failure of poetry, I also love poetry because of its diversity. There are thousands of ways to play with form, meter, diction, and spacing on the page. Poets are often told to explore new technologies, to get out of their comfort zone, or to think outside of the box. However, poets have to develop a comfort zone before they can get out of their comfort zone. Poets have to find a box before they can think outside of their box. Shakespeare wrote over 100 sonnets. Rumi wrote more than one ghazal. For poets at every level, it is important to experiment. Poetry is a buffet, and poets are cheating themselves if they do not sample what poetry has to offer. Poets should attempt a sonnet. Poets should pat themselves on the back after completing a villanelle or sestina. Poets should seek out new forms like bop poetry or kwansabas. Poets should see what happens to their voice when they revisit a poem written in quatrains and break the quatrains into couplets. These are just a handful of the near limitless experiments poets can attempt. However, one of the most important poetic experiments is the experiment of repetition. Once a poet finds a subject that feels comfortable, the poet should exploit that comfort. Poets should not be afraid of doing what they do well. Too often, I see poets who abandon their strengths. Too often, I see poets who are ashamed of their strengths. There should not be any shame in returning to the sonnet, the couplet, or the love poem. Poets should write the comfortable poem until they understand why the poem is comfortable. They should write the comfortable poem until they know they can write the comfortable poem effectively and understand why they can write the poem effectively. Once poets understand why a certain type of poem works for them or why they keep returning to a certain type of poem, then they can build on that poem. They can find other forms and subject matter to complement their favorite type of poem. I am lucky. I've been lucky enough to teach creative writing to great students at great colleges and universities. I've been lucky enough to find mentors and friends in the writing field who are greater writers than I would ever even dream to be. I've won a few awards and published a few books. However, as a poet, I know most of my luck stems from the confidence I gained from my advisor's critique of my graduate thesis. I know that I can write one good poem, and knowing that has given me the confidence to keep writing the next poem and the next and the next. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jason. That was wonderful. And I wonder how many people have had moments like that in a workshop or with, in a private conference with a professor where there's this kind of aha moment. It seems like it must almost be like a breakthrough in therapy to realize, oh my gosh, I'm writing the same poem over and over and over again. I think a lot of people probably have moments much like that. And so that's one of the wonderful things about reading through this manuscript, is feeling seen over and over again and knowing that this very solitary experience of being a writer I am a writer in secret, in addition to being a publisher. It's so universal, and we have the same experience as all of us. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for that, Jason. And I think I see Norman here. Is that right? Okay, awesome. Hi, Norman. I'm going to introduce you next. I see you're listed under Abayo's name, but
oh yeah, we couldn't find my email, so
I'm just so glad you were able to join us, and I'm sorry for the hiccup in getting you the link. So are you up for going next, Norman?
sure. What do you want me to do?
Well, I'm going to introduce you first, and
Okay.
then I just like to have you maybe talk for about 10 minutes about your contribution to the anthology. You can read from a section of it. We're going to go through each of the contributors tonight, and then we'll have an open discussion at the end with everybody that's joined us.
Okay.
Okay, wonderful. So Norman Minnick was born in Louisville, Kentucky. I know I didn't say that right. I'm sorry. I think you have to be from that city to say that. Can you do it once for me?
Yeah, the city was named after King Louis, so it's Louisville.
Louisville. Okay.
Yeah.
I'll get it eventually. His first collection of poems, To Taste the Water, won the first series award for poetry and was published by Midlist Press. His second collection, Folly, was published in 2013. He is the editor of Between Water and Song, New Poets for the 21st Century. Welcome, Norman.
Thank you. So I guess I'll just read maybe the first, it's in sections, so maybe I'll just read the opening section and then talk, and then, oh, I don't know, maybe it's not very long. I'll just read and see what happens. All right, so it's the piece is called Awakening the Dionysian Nerve, bringing poems off the page and into the body. Imagine taking a music class in which you are required to read the scores to music, but never actually listen to music. Too often, this is what happens in the classroom when we are asked to read poetry. Remember your 8th grade teacher telling you to turn to page 563 of your textbook, read a poem by Robert Frost, and then answer the questions that follow. You did as you were told, closed the book, and the poem was forgotten. Bringing poems off the page and into the body, in other words, memorizing and reciting poems, allows us not only to hear poems, but also experience them, to learn how a poem means as to what a poem means. The best way to understand poetry is to experience it. This goes against the traditional approach of dissection and analysis. Memorization opens complex pathways in the psyche, and as Lucio Mariani says, quote, allows the Dionysian nerve hidden in each of us to survive and become stimulated, so that we get to have the admittedly difficult but extraordinary experience of knowing a poem directly, unquote. As John Ciardi and Miller Williams explain in their landmark book, How Does a Poem Mean? The common question from which an approach begins is, what does the poem mean? In response, they write, the reader tends to interpret the poem rather than to experience it. The pianist will tell us that the arrangement of notes on the page is not the music. The music, she will say, is this, at which she will begin to play. The same is true for poetry. That is, the little black marks that we call letters, and we organize those into words are like music notes. They are only notations for how the poem is to be spoken, or sung as the case may be. The thing on the page we call a poem is no different than a score to a piece of music. This, of course, applies mainly to free verse poems that do not have an established meter, rhyme, scheme, etc. And here are some ideas to consider when memorizing and reciting a poem. And then the next section is about silence, and then the next section after that is on sound. And so I won't bore you by reading all those. You'll have to buy the book, I guess, to read the rest of the essay. But I can talk a little bit about, what else is in what you'll encounter in the rest of the essay, but also talk about the inspiration behind this essay and so forth. Is there anything in particular you want me to talk about, or is there any Questions, thoughts, concerns?
Well, as a musician,
Uh-huh.
most of my life, I love this whole overlay of sound that you put in there. So I would be real interested in some more thoughts you have about sound. My sort of feeling is that poetry doesn't really exist unless it's in the air.
Uh-huh.
You need to hear it, or at least internalize the sound as you're reading in a library or whatever. So would like more information about how you encounter sound and how you deal with it.
Yeah, and I
Actually, do you hear it as you write? Do you hear it and listen?
yeah, those are good questions. And I will kind of just summarize and maybe address some of the things in this part of the essay. But I want to point out that I list the section silence first, and I begin saying that any composer will tell us that silence is equally as important as the notes. That without silence, I go into talking about the root of the word spire, to breathe, what also means spirit, and so how inspiration comes both, I guess, figuratively and somewhat literally. Inspiration comes in the silences when we're allowed to pause and breathe in. And then, of course, with sound and I'm sort of thinking of the idea of a graphic equalizer on a stereo, and you know how the sound, the bars move up and down from the bass to the treble, and then how when we speak, those bars are moving up and down. And so the idea is to pay attention to how that equalizer is working when we're saying poems as well. And of course, I go through some examples, beginning with John Keats, "The poetry of earth is never dead," and try to show how that could take on different meanings depending on how we stress the words. If we say the poetry of earth is never dead, then we're focused on poetry. If we say the poetry of earth is never dead, then the subject kind of becomes the earth. And if we say the poetry of earth is never dead, if we place the stress there, then the poem takes on that nuance. And then, of course, the poetry of earth is never dead. These are subtle nuances, but I think it's extremely important that, the good thing, going back to music, with music, we have a lot of notations that tell us how to play a certain piece, where to rest, where to, the time signatures, where to put, crescendos and decrescendos and things like that. But in language, we don't have anything like that. So with poetry, free verse poetry especially, well, any poetry for that matter, it's up to us, the speakers of the poem, to figure that out, right? And so the only way to do that, I think, is, and as you mentioned, is to say it out loud, to bring it off the page, or at least hear it, in your head. And the beautiful thing about poetry like this is that there's no right and wrong answer. I might memorize this poem and say it to an audience, and I might stress the poetry of earth is never dead, and then, who knows, 6 months later, it may take on a different stress. The poem is constantly evolving. I don't know if it's in here. Yeah, the Emily Dickinson poem. "Exultation is the going of an inland soul to sea, past the houses, past the headlands, into deep eternity," right? And that's one of those poems that I read it for years and years and years just on the page. And the word exultation was so beautiful at the beginning of that line that I was so focused on that was the subject of the poem. But it wasn't until I memorized it, had internalized the poem, and one day, just out of the blue, it just struck me. I don't know, the poem was telling me, in my subconscious somewhere, that put the stress on going. So when I did that, I realized that it changed the scope of the whole poem. Exultation is the going of an inland soul to sea. So then all of a sudden, each line had that traveling outward movement. And of course, you know, I mentioned the, well, I thought I mentioned it. Yeah, the famous, you know, we all know to be or not to be, right? From Hamlet, to be or not to be. Is it that is the question, or that is the question, or that is the question? So we have to let the poems, I think, inform us how they're to be stressed and so forth. So I think that's where sound is very important, to listen to those sounds and pay attention to them so that we can get the meanings and stuff in the poem. Does that sort of coincide? Does that coincide with your musical experience, or?
Yeah, actually, because I mean, at some point you leave your teacher, and typically teachers want you to play like they do. And once you leave them with that and leave with that information, it actually gives you more freedom to develop whatever kind of sound universe, you know, resonates with you. And I feel the same way about writing and the same way about poetry, that it's a resonant issue. It's not a length issue necessarily at all,
Right.
or even a formal issue. But it's a resonance issue, and you can't really get that unless there's really an oral thing to it. Even the most nonlinear poem on the page, which may not need the air, is good to put in the air.
Right.
Just to let it fly and see, you know, see how it lands. But it is quite similar. That's one of the things I was struck in your essay was this guy knows about, you know, form and, you know, notation and thing, and escaping the notation is probably the biggest hurdle for us musicians.
Right.
Because that can become, you know, a noose.
Mm-hmm.
Musicologists particularly.
And I think a lot of this stuff is very like the you know, I think of all the spoken word artists, you know, all the great poets that are, you know, showing up in these, you know, cafes and bars and stuff, who are doing this great spoken word. There's a whole, you know, scene that's got some beautiful performance to it, and I think they get this, obviously, and I think this is all pretty I thought it was pretty common knowledge, but I was kind of surprised at how much resistance I've gotten to this in the halls of academia.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it seems like 90% of the world's okay with all this, except for the few who are stuck in academia. In many ways, I mean, poetry, in my mind, is more closely related to music than it is to, you know, fiction or nonfiction or any other kind of writing. I don't know why. I don't know who decided somewhere, maybe back in the Middle Ages, that they should stick poetry into the English departments. You know, I don't know whose idea that was. It seems to me, if anything, it should be over there with theater, you know.
Mm-hmm.
If not, I mean, it should have its own department, or maybe it doesn't belong in academia. I don't know.
Well, it's the constant tension between the academic scholarly approach, which I'm not bashing, we need
Right.
that, but also the practitioner.
Right.
You know?
Right.
And it's like Charlie Parker said, you know, at some point, get rid of all this shit and play.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, just go. And I spent the last 10 summers in Iowa, you know, at the workshop there, which has been absolutely incredible. But I remember the first time I suggested, you know, maybe we should think about poems living in the air. It was just like a foreign object. So that's why I was so attracted to the tonal aspects of your essay. I thought that hit it right on the mark.
Right.
At least for me, it resonated.
Well, John, why don't we, this kind of dovetails perfectly. Why don't we move on to your presentation from your essay, and then we'll wrap up with Emily before we open up to a larger conversation. And I'll just briefly introduce you. For everybody here, John Langfeld is a retired musician and arts educator living in Westchester, Illinois. I live in Westchester, New York, so I guess there's a bit of a kinship there. And he's been writing in various genres since 1981. His first book of poetry, There's a Brevetist Loosed in the Condensery, or If You Want Your Heart Broken, Read Somebody Else, was published in May of 2014. Since then, Langfeld's stories and poems have been published in print and online media. Welcome, John. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. I'm going to, I mean, I suppose as a disclaimer, my intent in writing this actually was before there was a call for this collection, was really thinking about a teaching tool for myself if I were still in the classroom, and if I were going to approach poetry, what is really the essence here of that craft. So that's kind of what I did. It's kind of a hands-on essay. So it's not just a narrative all the way through. What I want to do, I think, is if you're following along on 176, is just the basic essence of what I think about language, and then apply them directly to a poem. So our skills in using and responding to traditional language evolve over time, from the obvious to the more subtle in our younger years, to the literal and more abstract and metaphorical as we age. We begin our journey toward literacy by exploring the outward appearances of language, the obvious, and continue that journey by exploring the underlying forms, the more subtle. With a little help from our parents and books and a nurtured propensity for curiosity, we become more sophisticated the more we practice using and responding to language. For example, we initially learn to read from the outside in. When it is age appropriate and necessary, we learn to parse from the inside out. When we are facile enough with both reading and parsing, our ability to create meaning improves. Eventually, we learn to parse both directions responsibly before synthesizing, generalizing, and forming opinions. In other words, before making meaning. So it's an example of reading from the outside in and from the inside out. And I think I'll let this live in the air. And then the way the form works is the italicized are really the metacognitive part of it, the thinking about the work from in two different ways. So for example, the outward appearance, dealing with that before really digging in deeply to the form. The poem is Villanelle for the End of Days. Mindless repetition at the end of the day is like watching the same story on 6 different shows, realizing talking heads have very little to say. It is likely not easy getting ready for the fray with makeup on your face and powder on your nose, mindless repetition at the end of the day. You suppose they have chins up and before each take pray that the cue cards are ready and the bosses have toes, realizing talking heads have very little to say. You suppose they try hard not to stutter, not to bray, but to meet the high standards of the scripting they chose, mindless repetitions at the end of the day. You imagine their bosses with feet of clay and nary a vision but a sense of what flows, realizing talking heads have very little to say. So forget heads and toes, choose a different cachet. Read a book and relax, that who knows this knows. Mindless repetition at the end of the day is like watching the same story on 6 different shows. So the idea is once reading that, to try to get an oral feel for the piece, then what is it really about? I mean, good Lord. So up at the top there, next to the villanelle for the end of days, it's exaggerated. Is that meant to seduce both not only the form, but the end of days? And the first stanza sounds like pundit bashing, apparently one of the points. Second stanza, how do you take yourself seriously with powder on your nose while you recite whatever they're giving you on cards? Next, blind faith, trusting of the guy holding the cards. So you're reading what someone else is actually preparing for you. So you suppose they try hard not to stutter. Phony baloney, mindless high standards, that seems pretty much sarcastic. Bosses who read polls to assess success don't trust the star, the talking heads. Getting informed by reading, not TV, really. So from the outside of it, that seems to be the story, the plot, what's being said, what's the intention. If you turn the page, and then you want to go from the inside out, you want to really find out about how this thing is stuck together. So the title sounds traditional and almost biblical. It implies a formal structure. Better check out that structure, meaning the rhyming and the repetition, And if you just do the math and you make the sounds, the patterns are there. ABA, 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 ABA. My God, everything is ABA. And the lines are messed around and you have to repeat them in an order. Wow. Bottom. Okay. I looked up Villanelle, 5/3 liner is 1/4. Last stanza is supposed to be ABAA. The writer broke with this intentionally. A usual poet's trick, complicated form. So this writer is making fun of TV pundits in a rigorously classical way, an ironic, funny use of a tricky form that sounds very serious in the reading, but the point is a poke. Juxtaposition heightens the point and the poke. So that was just an attempt to set up the whole idea of dealing with the sound as it lives in the air, have that first impression, how it meets you and what the outside of it looks like and what it seems to be about, and then go on the inside to discover some of the structural elements. Not unlike looking at a cathedral, you know, it's gorgeous, but then, oh my God, look at those Gothic arches and so on. I mean, so it's a infrastructure kind of attempt. The rest of the essay does the same thing, but with different kinds of poems, shorter poems, a nonlinear poem about line dancing. There's also one that's up to the person who's ever reading this to figure out, which is in Guggenheim font, a supposed poem written by him in 2013, which is kind of amusing. And then at the very end is an addendum, which is really what I think about art and producing art and perceiving art, the two different things. The left side is what happens to the artists. The right side is what happens with the audience, essentially, and some criteria and messing with all that. That takes just some sitting down with, etc. So the essay, quote unquote, is really that, a setup of rules to follow, an application of those, just as an example, which would be a jumping off place to working class, whatever, and also different kinds of poems. So that's the intention of this particular piece. End of subject.
Thank you so much, John. I know it's a little more challenging for you because this is really a sort of it's more of a short section of a workbook than an essay that we have here from you. So it's a little bit more challenging to show people, but I think a number of you already have a copy of Far Villages with us and with you. And if you don't, I will drop a coupon code in the chat box just a little bit in case you want to place an order. But when I was prepping for this, I thought, I wonder how he's going to talk about this wild thing that he submitted to our anthology, and it was lovely to hear you speak from it. So
everything is connected. When Norman mentioned about grad school, I had to laugh because in doing two different dissertations, finishing either one, it was always the same thing I would hear from my advisors: get the Langfeld out, which I really had difficulty doing, so it would, fit in with the compendia. So I was kind of overjoyed at how different, that it was an essay from a brevitist point of view, minimal, and that it found its way here was just a terrific joy. I love that. But I do recognize it is it demands a little more seat time probably.
Well, thank you so much, John. And we're going to move on to Emily Stoddard. And then we'll hear from Emily, and then we'll open it up and just have a discussion with everybody who has questions. We've already got a couple of questions in the chat box. If you think of anything you'd like to chat about at the end, please drop a note there. Emily Stoddard's writing has appeared in Tinderbox Poetry Journal, New Poetry from the Midwest, Rust and Moth, Menacing Hedge, Gravel, and elsewhere. She is an affiliate of the Amherst Writers and Artists Method and founder of Voice and Vessel, a writing studio. She leads workshops and supports creative spirits online and in Michigan. Welcome, Emily.
Thanks. Thanks to everyone for being here, taking the time to make space for poetry. These Zoom gatherings have really been a joy in the midst of not so many joyful things happening this year. So it's just nice to see a bunch of poets on a screen. That's just like good company for the evening. So my essay is called Writing by Water Table. And Jason, what you said about all poets are Pandora, I just love that. I really love that line. And I feel like that's a little bit what I was trying to engage with. The question I carry into my own poetry practice is, how do we work with ourselves and have a relationship with instinct when it is Pandora waiting in there? And once you open it, how do you have a really down-to-earth relationship with it? So that's a little bit what I explore with this essay. So I'll start from the beginning with it. I won't read the whole thing. I'll just sort of talk through some of the big points in terms of where it goes with practice, because I'm also a big believer in not just talking about the act of writing, but bringing it into practice. So I'll try to give you some specific ideas for maybe doing that. All right. I grew up less than an hour's drive from Lake Michigan. When you spend summers with dunes over one shoulder and open water over the other, you quickly learn how the water table works. At a certain point in digging into the sand, every scoop is answered with a rush of water. Something deeper rushes forward to fill the gap where your hand or your plastic shovel has just been. Early on, maybe for your first few summers, this is a curiosity. Will the water always be there? How deep can I dig before it disappears? In the creative process, it's these deeper waters that I still do not entirely know or understand. It's these deeper waters, this source beneath the sand where I dig, that provoke me back to the empty page as a poet and writer. I do not exactly navigate them. Instead, I begin digging and eventually they appear. They ride along the surface, feeding the images and ideas that show up in poetry. For me, they are both the spirit behind the writing and the reason for writing at all. I want to know where the waters come from, what secrets they carry, what vessel they might fill. To keep digging until a form takes shape. Some days the form is a castle, intricate and beveled with light. Some days it is only a smooth mound that casts a shadow, a cool spot where I tuck my words away from direct sun. Early in the journey, and sometimes later when we face a block, it can be tempting to view this nameless, formless, shape-shifting creative energy with misplaced reverence. It carries so much potential and power, and it seems to operate so serendipitously or unconsciously that we don't try to harness it. We approach it as though it's an enlightened muse. Sometimes we treat it like a ferocious animal that leaps only when we aren't looking. The deeper creative flow is somehow the ultimate gift and the ultimate terror. To engage it directly, to count on it as a part of ourselves, might feel like sacrilege for some poets. If we do approach it directly, it's often with lowered eyes and a small bucket, expecting to receive only so much. Because some of us hold a superstition, especially as we're beginning to trust the images, the language, and sounds that roll through our poems. If I use that stunning idea today, I accept that there may not be another for some time. So I need to covet that idea, treat it tenderly, and woo it into something greater. I'll give it only the right words at the right time. How many poems have been smothered this way? Some of us hold a fear. If I tell that one story I've been carrying with me, the bucket will be empty, the water will run dry. I'll have used up my creative purpose. Maybe better not to start at all. Better to peek into the bucket from time to time and grieve for that lonely story, to walk in circles around the poem that might have been the poem. How many stories have gone silent because they carried the weight of an entire creative life? Who really knows what else lives in the shadows of the bucket or in those deeper waters? In this way, how we approach the empty page reveals how much scarcity is often woven into our beliefs about creativity and poem making. Do I believe in a kind of divine and fleeting inspiration? Absolutely, I do. But do I believe we must approach it with fragility? The more I write, the more I'm convinced otherwise. Over a handful of summers carving at the sand along Lake Michigan, you begin to notice that the water will always be there. You develop a certain instinct for just how deep you must dig before it shows up. You even begin your digging with this knowing. You plan on the possibility of water rising up to meet you. You imagine castles surrounded by moats and small rivers. As a poet, it becomes one of the most irresistible parts of the journey, learning to trust that if you reach your hand down and open your palm, you can catch a word or an image from the deeper waters. It's a trust that doesn't leave much room for scarce thinking. Getting here is like learning to build more complex sandcastles. It can take a few seasons to discover that this is a choice you can make, that this is not just a surprise gift from the muse, but an orientation to receiving the world, an orientation that a poet can actually practice. So I'll stop there. And what I share in the essay is I break down what I call the raw material practice that I use to start to have this relationship with the deeper waters and the things that come through in that space. And I think one of the biggest things for me as I've gone deeper into the writing journey is really appreciating how much there is so much space before a first draft. I think one of the pressures we sometimes bring our poetry is that if I write these rough lines, they're a first draft. It's a rough draft. And what I have found to be most liberating is actually thinking about much more as raw material and things that I'm pulling from those deeper waters and creating a practical, real space for. And then traveling with those as long and as wholeheartedly as I can, and then having a conscious way to bring them into practice as a working draft. And just that distinction between those two spaces in the creative process has been very freeing. And so the thing I do with the raw material practice is I'll email myself things. I will use the ugliest notebook I can find. It's never something pretty. It has to feel practical. Otherwise, I'll treat it as only for special ideas. And any bits of insight, flashes of memory, those words and lines that fall in our ear, truly taking them and putting them in this place, tagging them as raw material, not treating them as precious first drafts. The thing about this is the more you do it, putting your dreams there, putting any memories there, instincts, is it creates that ongoing thread with instinct. And so it's always there as kind of an open channel between the two of you. And it creates a place for those patterns to show up that we love as poets. So for me, what happened is once I had the tools for this, I started just saying yes to anything that wanted to show up. And I said, no matter how weird or strange it is, this is just a relationship with instinct. Like Pandora's box, like Jason said, I'm peeking into the box, but whatever comes out, I've got a place for it to go. And I don't have to judge what it's going to become yet, because I know it's just raw material. So I receive it. And truly, this is what led me to find the through line for what became what is now my first manuscript that is at publishers right now. I had an image that showed up. I received it. It was weird phrasing, but I thought, kind of like the living in the air idea. It fell in the air in a certain way. It was like, that's a little strange. Normally, I would have thought that's too half-baked to be anything worth working with. But I thought, well, I have these raw material tools. I put it there. And very quickly, it started accumulating. I didn't know it was doing that. But when I went back 6 months later, a year later, I realized, oh God, the bird and that image and the words and the phrasing of it even is repeated everywhere. It's like a signature that's happening. And I didn't know I was working on an emerging collection at that point. But the raw material in that conversation with instinct was what basically said, oh, you just didn't know it. We were having this conversation and you finally caught up. So that's why I love tools like that. And like I said at the beginning, I really try to emphasize keeping these things as down to earth as we can, because I know it's easy as poets to move into that abstract headspace. So I find tools like that kind of keep my feet on the ground, keep my hand out in the deeper waters, and just open to whatever comes. So that's my little contribution for tonight. And I just really appreciate the chance to share.
Thank you so much, Emily. That was wonderful. I think that, that's something so many of us can relate to is, I have this idea, now I have to immediately make it into something useful and perfect right now, or it's ruined. I really appreciate that. I appreciate everybody's contributions. We do have a couple of questions to put to the panel. And this one comes from Natalie Homer. Do you all scan your own poems when you write them? I've never really gotten the hang of scansion. So anyone want to jump in on that? Oh, Jason, hold on. I got to
Go.
There you go.
Hey, I'll jump in just to admit I don't scan. And for me, I think I blame it on the fact that I came to poetry from the idea of storytelling. And so I've always got like a conversational idea in my head. And so for me, the idea of sound, like I'm never gonna be a sonic poet. And that doesn't mean I pay attention to sound and rhythm and pacing. But very early on, I realized the idea of stressed and unstressed syllables, iambic, spondy, I could never really get that. And so for me, once I realized, well, that was one of my weaknesses as a poet, I just became attracted to other parts of poetry, if that makes sense.
I would say it depends on where the poem either came from or was going. Um, if it was a sound I was after that was, you know, Elizabethan, well, I would do the work and make sure I had the right, you know, the right pentameter, iambic, or whatever I was doing. But overall, I'd say no. Probably a bad thing.
I'd like to jump on something Jason just said. You said you didn't quite, I can't remember how you said it, but that wasn't, you didn't think you got it, or you know, you mentioned spondies and things like that. I think you do, you just don't, you know, you don't use the technical terminology, right?
Yeah, and I guess that would be the best way to look at it, where I don't actively scan.
Right.
And I know there are some poets that I've worked with, some of that who are active in the sound of a poem. And that kind of relates to, I guess, in some ways, your piece when you mentioned the idea of like hearing poetry out loud. And I know for some people that's at the foreground when it comes down to the idea of the sound, whether it's the idea of counting syllables, whether it's the idea of stressed and unstressed syllables. And I know for some people that part of the creative process is more in the foreground. And for me, that's probably more part of the background revision process when it comes down to shaving words, when it comes down to word economy, when it comes down to the idea of what repetition is in the poem, what sounds pop up over and over again. So for me, I guess maybe it's more of a tonal issue than a sound issue, even though those things are related, obviously.
Yeah. I in my essay, I deliberately excluded any kind of jargon, you know, for the most part from that, because I mean, for one thing, it's for new and beginner poets, but even if it was for advanced poets or anyone else, I mean, I feel like, no, I mean, most poets, we scan the lines, but not in that sort of technical way where we draw the dashes and the, you know, the little eyelashes and stuff like that. But certainly sounding it out and hearing it and you know, changing the order of the words and things for that. I guess if you call that scansion, then yeah, but I not in the way I did in grad school where we had to go through and mark, you know, each foot and so forth.
Yeah, I was similar to all of you, that, and maybe not similar in the sense that I struggled so much with scansion, it felt like revisiting geometry. I mean, it was just terrible, you know, so it just never seemed to, the sounds don't, sound is I think Jason used the word tonal, it's an energy and a tone thing for me. And so there was something about scansion. I do try to revisit that because I think it's a little bit like, you know, people who are incredible at jazz actually know a lot about the structure of music. And so they're riffing because they have that basic understanding. And so I want to honor that in my own practice, but I don't try to keep it as a gatekeeper to any deeper work with a poem into that relationship. I care a lot about tone. I listen for things like open and closed sounds. Because I think those are things that can create really interesting repetition and echoes in a poem. I love when sound and imagery can work together. So if there's a sound that can evoke an image that's already been planted somewhere, I love, then it's like the material in conversation with sound. And yeah, I just think there's a lot that can be done in other ways, almost to use tone and energy as momentum and echoing in the poem versus, you know, and I think scansion does do some of that, but sometimes it just gets, for me, I end up getting more wrapped up in what it is or isn't and how the poem is behaving or not in a certain way versus just the movement of it.
I love that, and I love that we're sort of discussing where poetry lives, right? Does it live in the air? Is it something that you have to create in this certain way, scan your poem as you make it? And I want to think more about this idea of where does poetry belong? Does it belong in the English department? Does it belong with the actors and the musicians? And one of the things that I think is so exciting about this anthology is that it's certainly trying to sort of rip poetry out of the ivory tower and hand it to anyone who would like to have it. So if you could sort of rebrand poetry, as this whole new thing, where would you put it? What would you call it in the university system, or even in the just the K through 12 education system? Would you put it in gym class? I mean, that would kind of work, wouldn't it? Like learning to dribble to a certain poem. That would totally work.
That could be really interesting.
I think when you're talking about K through 12 schools, I think we should ban it. I think we should tell the students that this is not, you're not ready for this. This is too risky for you. It's got a lot of, kind of like rock and roll or hip hop, they don't allow that stuff in schools. And so kids will seek that stuff out on their own. The minute we ban it, they're going to be rushing to the stores to steal copies of poetry books. And that's going to be awesome.
I love that. I love that. I know that, smoking is no longer cool, and that's wonderful, but it was very cool when I was in high school. And that's why we all wanted to do it. Because that wasn't allowed.
I think some of it's a geographical thing as well. For example, in my experience as a high school teacher for 41 years, I taught hip hop, we did rap, we did all of those kinds of things to find out what about the infrastructure of music either embraces that or doesn't embrace that. And it was really rather amazing. Even tried to get them to write a rap villanelle, which worked. And I said, yes, you could swear. But so that they would understand that this hysterical sounding villanelle in a rap style, following the sounds and the patterns that they're supposed to, actually worked in that genre as well. So it just as that kind of poetry should be included, that kind of stretch wherever it resides, whether it's in English or humanities or whatever. I don't know. I don't much care. I think one of the things that would be tied to it, and this is another discussion, but if we were going to be really interested in the literacy of students about language, well, there you go. You'd have to include poetry, in terms of the cultural literacy. But it can happen. It's tricky. And for a geezer to do it, you have to unlearn a lot of, old-fashioned habits and ways of being. But I can imagine dribbling an iambic pentameter.
Yeah. We have a couple more good questions that just came through. This is from our editor, Abayo, for Emily. I love the idea of trusting the creative impulse. When do you feel you started trusting the creative impulse, and what led to it?
Oh, that's a big question, Abayo. So when did I start? And trust is a big thing too. And so one of the things I tell the writers I work with at my studio is that I will never ask them to trust their instinct. I always say trust follows practice. And so I'll ask them to practice. I'll invite them to try that. I'll invite experimentation, but trust follows practice. And so I have kind of a two-part answer. Creative impulse. I'm one of those people who I think I've always had a relationship with my images. My imagination is very image driven. And I think that kind of inner life probably saved me in childhood and, high school and everything a lot. And so that's one part of the impulse. But in terms of taking that impulse and turning it into writing and a writing life, one big thing for me was stumbling into the Amherst Writers and Artists Method, which was founded by Pat Schneider. I found her book, Writing Alone with Others. And that method really made me question the ideas I had about what a writer is or isn't, because we really just say a writer is someone who writes, and then break down the practice from there into very tangible, down-to-earth things, so that there's kind of, you know, nothing left to do but just enjoy beginning. So when I really started practicing with that, and then became a leader of the method, simply because I just wanted to know what is the magic of this thing, because it got me to that generative place. That's where then the creative impulse, this relationship I'd had with inner images and inner life, and I'd always been a writer, but I definitely in my 20s, you know, we all have those seasons where we kind of lose our way and different things happen. And so I needed a way to come back, and I needed it to be something concrete. And that method really did help. Prompt writing, writing down my dreams, those are things that kind of really got me into not just fun, enjoyable practice, but something I could actually sustain, something that would sustain me and I could sustain it. Mm-hmm.
That's wonderful. Yeah, I love Pat Schneider's book, and I also am familiar with it. There's a wonderful organization here in New York called the New York Writers Coalition.
Yes.
If you're familiar with them, and they do teacher trainings, and they have people lead workshops all throughout New York City. And I was very luckily was able to be one of their teachers for a little while. So
oh, that's wonderful. Yeah, I was trained by their leader, so yeah, I love them. Yeah, he's great.
Small world, very small.
Yeah.
And then I have a question for Jason. This is also from Abayo. Is there a form that you go to again and again?
Form, in some ways it's project based. I guess I'll talk about what I'm working on right now. Right now I'm working on a project that's based around the folk hero John Henry. And so because of that, I'm really invested in like the music around him. There's the old John Henry song, maybe some of us learned in school. But for me, just kind of by circumstance, I started to learn that, of course, the legend of John Henry was in some ways tied to American prison policy and convict leasing policy. And depending on John Henry is one of the most researched songs, apparently, as people have tried to track down who John Henry is. And so for me, I've started to look at a lot of bop poetry, and bop poetry incorporates music. The general setup of a bop poem is you have a 6-line stanza as a setup, and then you have a song lyric that you've pulled from a song. You have a 6 or 8-line middle stanza. You repeat the song lyric again, and then you have a 6-line closing stanza or resolution, and then you repeat the song lyric again. The form, I guess, is relatively new. I think it's Alpha Weaver. I think 2007, 2008 maybe is what they give him credit for. And so for me, in a lot of cases, the form, it's a bit cliche, but there's the idea that form follows function. And so for me, for this project, the idea of finding ways to incorporate music or the echoes of music into this project has led me to look at a lot of bop poetry as a way to kind of bring some of those songs into the manuscript, instead of just it being a reference point or an allusion, to actually bring the music into the poem. Using that form has been really effective for me.
I have a follow-up, Diane. So Jason, I love all of what you're saying. I guess my follow-up question is, what kinds of difficulties or challenges are you experiencing trying to bring together a new form with a person and an occurrence from history and a song that's been with us for a long time? What kinds of challenges are you facing trying to bring those two entities into the same space?
Luckily, the headaches so far have been productive headaches. And I think we have some of those as a writer. I think one of the headaches, of course, is like when it comes down to the history of the event, no one really knows if John Henry is real or not. Or, I mean, there's some theories that he was in Virginia, West Virginia. There's even a fringe theory that says he was down here in Alabama. But also with the music, when it comes down to the idea of tracking down music, I know even for a lot of us, we can hear a song And then years later, we find out, oh, well, our favorite song is actually a cover of an older song. And even in the world now of all the streaming services, sometimes you stumble on a song and you realize, well, I thought that belonged to so-and-so, but it actually belonged to a singer years and years past. And so for me, the difficulty, I realized early on in the project that my obsession with putting a definitive version of history was a losing battle. And the more interesting thing was to really look at, why was this history so multifaceted? Why was there an intersection of music and racial history and histories of American labor all wrapped around this one character? So for me, once I realized the difficulty of getting things right, if that makes sense, I realized there was a really creative opportunity to talk about, why can't we get things right when it comes to this folktale? We can't get things right because there are so many intersecting points of culture and history and society, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. I had one more question from Abayo that I'll read, and this one's for Norm. Do you go by Norm or Norman?
Norm is fine.
Okay. In your essay, you talk about poems being living, breathing creatures. Could you talk more about this?
Well, I can. I'm not on mute, am I? No. The analogy that I like to use is, and again, I keep going back to the way poetry was ruined, but for so many of us in schools, is the way it would be like if you were to study insects, by just looking at the, those glass frames that have the insects pegged to the board, with pins, and then under each insect is a little slip of paper that tells you its Latin name and whatever. And we, hopefully if you study insects, you wouldn't just study them by looking at those boards with a dead insect pinned to it. You would go out into, the world and actually see them as they're living and breathing and in their own environments. But I want to defer to Emily on this. She said something a minute ago that I thought was really interesting. And I'm going to butcher it if I try to rephrase it here, so I'll let her do it. But she said something about and for Emily, forgive me, you'll have to rephrase this for me. But you said something about when a poem comes, you hope you can give it the right words or in phrasing or something like that. Do you remember that?
Oh man, can you give me a little more of what I said?
No. It was that you said when you encounter a poem or when a poem comes or something, you hope you can give it the right words and images or something like that. And I thought that's interesting because the whole idea that a poem exists, whether it's within us, and that it's up to us to put it down on paper. And when that happens, it's up to us, or or is that poem going to continue or, to live and thrive as it's intended. I like the idea anyway of the poem having some kind of life or intention beside what we have to say for it.
And we're recipients, we're not just makers. That's kind of the distinction there. We're stewarding something, we're saying yes to this gift that's shown up. And I don't mean to be precious about that. That's part of why I keep coming back to this practice word. We're doing that in a real way. When we put it on the page, it's not just, oh, I got to get that down, I've got to craft that. You're saying yes. Every time we put it on the page, there's a yes there. There's a agreement to a conversation with something. And this might be in part because I'm very attached to image. I'm led by images a lot in my poetry especially. And so I feel like images do that kind of, work sort of. It's like how dreams work, that's just how they show up. So maybe that's just my own relationship to it. But yeah, I just, that's kind of the way, that's just being in that recipient mode. And so how do we make ourselves more open to and prepared for it? And the way we can do that is with those practical tools, by knowing that there's a tag waiting for it, that we send ourselves that note, or we have a certain way of returning to the raw material.
Yeah.
I was really fascinated by your raw material. Some people might call that toolbox. Should I not be talking?
I think you're good.
Okay.
I don't know.
About 10 years ago, in thinking about this, you know, you receive this impulse, whatever language. I was in a workshop and I thought the assignment was really stupid that we had to do overnight. And I thought, you know, damn it, why doesn't this poem speak for itself for once? So I wrote A Poem Speaks, Part 1, which fulfilled the assignment and was clever and all that sort of stuff. That became an incredible conduit over the years to practice all of the craft things, because I never decide, okay, I'm going to write a poem speaks. They sort of appear and push me around. And one of them, which was published somewhere, it doesn't matter, they wanted a poem of 32 words or less. Well, I'm a brevetist guy, so that was right up my alley. So I did one in 8 words, thinking, oh, but all of a sudden the poem spoke. And it said, a poem is a museum. There are benches. That was it. And I thought, how about it? I bet these poems are really tired of people just breezing by them, not letting them live in the air, as you know, as Norman was talking about. But that's sort of become raw material. I think there's 132 of them now, most of them which are crap, but it's still kind of something that is its own sort of world in addition to whatever else, you know, comes along. So I guess my point is sometimes infrastructure is also really good raw material, as in addition to intuition. You know, like, and we've all said, okay, I feel like writing, but I don't know what. I know I'm going to write a triolet. What the hell is a triolet? So I have to look that up. And then how do you make something sound wonderful and you don't notice it's a triolet? You know what I mean? So I mean, the infrastructure can also be part of the raw material. At least that's what the poems tell me.
Yeah, I mean, instinct does love a conversation with intention, and it's about like creating tools that let the paradox and tension between them happen. That's, you know, why creative constraints can be so wonderful. I love what you're saying there, though, around like a certain family or type of raw material, that it has its own constraints, and then within that box, you've got a whole plethora of possibilities in that constraint. That's very cool.
Another thing, just related to that, I had like, I don't know, 30 some journals over the years. I started writing in 1980, and they were all lost in a flood, the whole damn thing. But for some reason, I had put all of this stuff on computer back then, 10 years ago or whatever. So, I mean, my hand, I can't even deal with writing anyway. So when the time comes to really work through, as you say, in all of the drafts, because of its accessibility, the raw material in this thing, I could say, geez, where is the word confession popped up? Boom, you know? So, I mean, that is another, I think, incredibly freeing thing that technology allows. So I appreciated the lack of romantic Velcro on the forehead and wrist kind of stuff. You know, it's work, it's practice, it's intuition, it's all of those things.
Makes you appreciate people who made concordances before computers. You know?
Yeah. Oh, my
Through,
word.
by just going through and counting all that.
Yeah.
You're on mute. I think you're on mute.
Sorry. John, we've got one more question for you, and then I think we'll probably wrap up with that unless anyone has one last burning question for anyone on the panel to address. And this is, when did you start being comfortable with nonlinear poems, and did a particular poem or poet help you in this regard?
Wow. I'd have to say probably around 1980 or so, because of the nature. It was tied up to a humanities class I was teaching, and I wanted them to write. So we were all journaling like crazy, and they said, well, Langfeld, you have to do it too. And I'm like, okay, no problem. So I just started writing poetry because I could really make any old thing I wanted. I didn't know if I wanted to say exactly what I felt about things, if that is, which is where the original impulse comes. Like I had 2 rules for myself. Don't be self-indulgent and don't show off. If you're going to use some la-di-da form, don't make it so apparent. You know, that's part of the infrastructure. So in the beginning, because I was kind of hiding behind poetry, the nonlinear kinds of things were a piece of cake because it was fun to do. I was very interested in atonal music, which didn't follow, you know, the typical traditional kinds of things. So it was sort of part of my way of being in those years. It formally only occurred probably 10 years ago in my first summer with the Iowa Summer Writing Festival. Which has been incredible. I've been there 10 summers. They canceled it this summer. But Michael, I think his name is Jackson, in one of these workshops, had said to me, because I was doing something kind of short and brief and nonlinear, he said, John, yes, my training as a Catholic, yes, sister, you are an epigrammatic poet. Don't let anyone ever change that. I said, okay. I had no idea what he was talking about, of course. So I go home and look up what epigrammatic meant. I was like, oh my God, you know, brief, concise. Well, the shorter, the better, as far as I'm concerned. So that sort of lends itself to more nonlinear ways of posing things to and about the world, if I can put it that way. I really appreciated reading Stephen Dunn. For some reason, I said, wow, I get this guy. And someone had told me, you need to read Stephen Dunn. So I read Stephen Dunn, and that was quite a revelation. So I'm drawn to the poets who are not all that verbose, but who really, in their museum, they want you to sit down and ponder this for a bit, not just sail by. So I would say that's probably an evolution of that side of my craft or practice, as Emily would say. But formally, I'm not sure. It just sort of, I mean, I was like 40 years old when I started writing, you know, or 35 or whatever. So I didn't have to sail through the academic part of it so much. Just reading and writing and seeing how things landed. I did a reading in New York for something that was published in a journal there. And it was awful. I hated it. All anybody wanted to do was talk about their work, you know, elbow you out of the way so they could say, look at me, and you look at my work. It was so odd. And there wasn't a nonlinear poem in the bunch. Anyway, so I think it's an evolutionary thing, and I think it's a stylistic thing. When you find your voice and a consistent kind of sound for your voice, it's kind of like I can tell you it's Schubert in 2 seconds, only because I've listened to a gazillion Schuberts. Writers have the same kind of, the same kind of way. William Carlos Williams, you know, give me two words and you know it's him just by the sound of it. So not one thing, evolutionary, I would say. Love of brevity. Good question.
Good answers. And so we're gonna wrap it up there. Thank you all so much to our contributors who joined us tonight, Jason, John, Emily, and Norm, and also to everyone who joined us. I know we have an international crowd here with people from as far away as, was it Bangkok? Is that right? Did I have that right? Okay, that's so wonderful.
How many people were hanging around?
Yeah, we were talking earlier about how when we release anthologies, we often try to find out, you know, there are authors clustered in various places. Oh, maybe we could have something in Boston, maybe we can have something in Sacramento. We've never had an event in Bangkok before, so it's wonderful that this format opens us up to an international community of poets. It's just such a delight. I'm sorry. I also just wanted to say that I put 2 different links in the chat box here. If you are interested in getting a copy of Far Villages, You can order it. I have a huge stack of them right here in my office. I will personally deliver them to you. Well, no, I'm sorry, not mail them. I won't show up. We're not allowed to do that right now. It's COVID. But I will personally mail your copy. We're having a 40% discount right now for back to school. And then we will also have an event next week talking about craft. And we will have Sean Ballard, Jaden DeWald, Nathan McLean, Zoe Brigley, and Stacy Belkin to talk about form next week. So it'd be delightful to have you. It was same, also Tuesday, same time. And this has just been an absolute delight. Thank you so much for everybody who was here tonight. It's been wonderful to participate.
Will you email us the link so if we want to just watch next week?
So if you want to see and watch later any of our events, you can go to the Far Villages book page, which is also in one of the links that I gave you, and you can rewatch our conversations.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, well, everyone stay safe out there, stay healthy, and especially if any of you are anywhere close to the West Coast right now, boy, I hope everything is as safe and healthy as possible. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank
Have a
you.
good one.
Thanks.
Nice to meet you all.
Yes.